Good morning, everybody. I ask that you take your seats. We like to begin exactly at 8:30, so we take seats. I'm Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to the 136th City Law Breakfast in a series that's now, 22, 23 years old. Let me introduce first the Dean and President of New York Law School, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross, and want to wish all of you a good day and welcome to New York Law School, or as you know, we like to say, New York's Law School. And it's an exceptional privilege today to host our Correction Commissioner, Joseph Pont, who's going to offer us his unique perspectives on one of the most challenging jobs in municipal government, and probably one of the most challenging jobs anywhere in America these days, given the backdrop in which he is performing his duties. And he, along with Mayor de Blasio, have been extremely proactive and aggressive in trying to implement a variety of new policies and to work to improve our correction system here in New York City. Obviously, everything is a work in progress and much work needs to be done, but it's a wonderful opportunity for us today to hear what's going on at the Department of Correction and to get a better understanding of what we can do as citizens to ensure the process works and what we as a law school community can do to help ensure the most fair and equitable criminal justice system. Ross?
Yeah, well, I like to applaud the Dean of the Law School. First, let me, before I do the introduction, I want to thank our sponsors for the breakfast, our longtime founding sponsors who've been wonderful and with us so long, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Consolidated Edison, and Verizon. They have been with us and helped make these breakfasts possible and free and open and be able to have 136 of them. I'd also like to thank a special sponsor of this breakfast, as we do, Jim Capolino and his firm, a friend for 40 years. And I really appreciate your willingness to support this breakfast as well. I also would like to acknowledge the staff of the law school who worked so hard to put this together, and particularly the staff of the center, Brian Kasuba, the assistant director, Lillian Valley Santiago, our assistant, Jesse Deno, Jonathan Sizemore. They have done a terrific job, and we thank them for all their hard work. I'd also like to thank those of you who have gold stars on your name plates. Those indicate that you voluntarily contributed to help support these breakfasts, and we do really appreciate that. So today is really an important day for us. Nothing in some ways is more important to the law school and our students and the community than the prison systems and the criminal justice system. And it has long been my desire to have the commissioner here. We had a predecessor, Martin Horn, speak in 2008. And that talk was memorable, and I have no doubt that this will be really an important talk. Commissioner Pont has more than 45 years in the correction field. He is a well-known, respected leader of reform, and that was what brought him to New York City. He began his career in the Marines in 1965 to 1969, the Vietnam era. Bachelor degree in political science, starts off in the correction field as an officer, moves up the field and has been a warden in many states and different systems. So he brings an enormous amount of practical experience to the job here. He was a warden in Nevada, Florida, Tennessee, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and now here in New York at the large system of New York City. His immediate past position was Commissioner of the Maine Department of Correction, where he earned praise by all sides for the reforms, his openness, his willingness to bring people into the system, to show them what's going on, and then to reform it and make it better for staff, better for inmates, better for the public. He was appointed on March 11th by Mayor de Blasio 2014, and the task was simple: reform Rikers Island and make it a better place. He said, I went back and looked at the statement at the time, and he said something I thought was really interesting. He said, the debate today about corrections is how do we do our business? Accepted practices are no longer accepted. That's a reform mantra. And he then went on to say that the importance to keep children out of the system, attack the cause of violence, and identify issues by asking questions as to what causes the behaviors that we do not want to happen in our prison system. And he was off on a reform agenda from the very beginning, eliminating punitive segregation for those 16 to 18 years old. But then a lot of other things happened, including a report by the U.S. Attorney's Office, intervention in a lawsuit, ultimately a negotiation of a consent decree, which now is governing the reforms. And the article that you have in the city law and on the table is my attempt to summarize both the consent decree and the report that came out on the first quarter. And let me just say about the decree that it is exceedingly ambitious as to its goals, nothing short of changing the culture of Rikers Island. It is detailed in a specific step by step on what has to be done, and it's explicit in its skepticism that without the external forces, that reform would not happen. Commissioner Pont now has partners in his reform efforts in the form of the federal judge and lawyers, in addition to Mayor de Blasio, and he has continued to work so hard and to work successfully to bring those reforms that will ultimately change the culture and make it better for staff and for inmates at Rikers Island. He wrote an op-ed piece in the Daily News, and the last line, I think, is another coda, another mantra for it. He says that walking back from reform is not an option. We're delighted to bring the Commissioner of Correction to this podium, Joseph Pont.
Oh, good morning. Thank you, Ross, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm glad you all could take time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to what we've been working on the last couple of years in the New York City Department of Corrections. I think as we talk about the job, I think it's adequately phrased as the most difficult job in the city of New York, with probably as many competing interests, meaning that there's a push and a pull from all sides. If we do this, we have to deal with this side, and so we have the advocates, we have federal court, we have our unions, we have our staff. So a lot of pieces and moving parts, like in any organization. But after years of neglect, Mayor de Blasio, as he came in office, accepted the mandate that we needed to create a safe Department of Corrections. I came on board in April of 2014, and the first thing I did, coming new to any organization, is to look what have people said before, what plans are on the table, what things have we said to City Council, what budget requests did we have in place to move the agency forward. I was surprised to learn that there were no plans, there were no long-term plans, there was no plans to meet our staffing needs. You know, we have a 20-year retirement bill, staff leave in 20 plus years on the job. We had no plans on how we were going to meet the outflow of staff. So how are we going to bring enough staff on board to meet the need of staff leaving? We were creating a deficit in every class. We had no plans to make our jail safer. We had no plans to fix our crumbling infrastructure. So the first things we took was to really take first things we did was to take a top to bottom look at the organization. We took an organizational health survey, much of those, the type of instruments you go out and ask staff about job satisfaction. We had open forums. We had, I do a lot of focus groups with line staff to get feedback directly from them. What we heard wasn't good. I mean, staff were telling us that this organization had deserted them years ago, that staff did not feel supported, that staff did not feel appreciated, that staff were working in conditions that we would not want inmates to live in, never mind staff to work in. The physical plant in these jails had deteriorated to a point that some of the locking systems had not worked in 10-plus years. So the locking systems in the jail that had been designed a certain way for more than 10 years had not even worked as designed. A key result of these meetings and planning was our 14-point anti-violence agenda. As you see, we covered obviously everything from keeping weapons and drugs out of Rikers Island, classification, housing design, emergency response. So out of this 14-point plan, I won't bore you by reading that to you, but they're on these slides. The 14-point anti-violence agenda was created to aggressively combat violence and promote a culture of safety across the department. Spun off from the 14-point plan, there was 316 initiatives already accomplished in the last couple of years. It is a comprehensive plan that covers all the necessary changes needed to reform Rikers Island and the entire department after years of neglect. Years before, in 2011, as Ross mentioned, the Legal Aid Society, along with two private firms, filed a class action lawsuit known as the Nunes case against the City of New York for alleged pattern and practice of excessive force against inmates in violation of their civil rights. A year later, in 2012, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York conducted an investigation into the treatment of male inmates aged 16 and 18. In the report issued in August, in response to their investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office and Department of Justice found, and I'll quote from their report, that the department had engaged in a pattern and practice of excessive and unnecessary uses of force, failed to adequately protect inmates from inmate violence, and placed inmates in punitive segregation at an alarming rate for excessive periods of time, end quote. In October 2015, months after launching our 14-point anti-violence agenda, the City of New York negotiated, after many months, final settlement agreement of the Nunes DOJ case with the Legal Aid Society and the Department of Justice. This agreement outlined reforms to create safer jails in line with our 14-point plan, and has gone beyond that when we have gone beyond that with our reforms. We have required more hours of training for our officers. We have expanded resources for our younger inmates, ended punitive seg for 16 and 17-year-olds in December of 2014, and in June of this year for 18-year-olds. We have effectively ended punitive seg for 19 to 21-year-olds, and we say that because the national standard of punitive segregation is more than 22 hours locked in cell in any day. So we do not do that for our 18 to 21-year-olds. While no assault on officer or other staff is ever acceptable, major violence indicators have been dropping in the department since the reforms began taking place. So you may have read recently about articles on the numbers, and you know, our numbers are not good. You know, we need to do a lot more work and reduce the violence. We need to do a lot more work to keep our staff safer. Our comments, our numbers are showing a good trend. Many more years of work left to be done. Creating a culture of safety for our reforms starts and ends with our officers. So we don't do anything in jails and prisons without our correction officers on board. I have often stressed that the safety of our officers is paramount in our reforms. When staff are trained, supported, and empowered, we get very good results. As part of our reforms, the city invested nearly $200 million on officer safety, which includes $72.5 million for 100% camera coverage and x-ray machines, replacement of emergency response equipment, $51 million for the hiring of additional officers. And these are just some of the willingness of the city, both City Council and City Hall, to step up and give us the resources to bring these changes forward. Increased camera coverage to monitor inmate movement. You know, when we were negotiating the agreement, we were asked to put cameras in specific areas, and during that negotiation, the mayor stepped up and said, we're going to camera everything. So we're going to have 100% camera coverage in all of our facilities, beginning with the facilities on Rikers Island and eventually the facilities in our boroughs. Prior to this administration, only 18% of our facilities had coverage. Meanwhile, investments in X-ray machines and scanners, K-9 units, and investigative teams are helping to keep drugs and weapons and contraband out of Rikers. These investments have helped us to find 35% more contraband in the first 8 months of this year, excuse me, from January to August compared to the same period last year. Keeping weapons and drugs out of Rikers is the first item on our 14-point anti-violence agenda. Obviously, crimes committed in jail, be it weapons, drugs, create more violence in our facilities. We have also increased focus on swiftly prosecuting inmates for assaults on staff. We have beefed up our Correctional Intelligence Bureau by adding a dedicated arrest unit with staff of 9 to put together priority cases presented to the Bronx DA to speed up the arrest and prosecution of inmates who assault our staff. It would be also helpful if we, when sentencing for these crimes, that they were consecutive sentences because those would be more meaningful in the prosecution of these cases. Total inmate arrests in the department rose 92% in the first 8 months of the year compared to last year, from 499 to 960. And we are doing much more. We are looking for the best qualified candidates to become correction officers. Our aggressive recruitment approach includes having a dedicated applicant investigative unit whose sole purpose is to investigate correction officer applications. Our applicant investigating unit has gone from 19 employees in August of 2014 to 87 today, including investigators, psychologists, nurses, doctors, and field teams, social media teams, and not qualified teams to go out and actually visit neighborhoods, visit these applicants to make sure we're hiring the best possible. Our graduation class in May of 2016 had more than 600 recruits. Our class of 750 started in June of 2016, and approximately 1,200 recruits will compromise the next class, will begin in December of this year. Doing all of that, which has doubled and tripled recruitment and hiring, we will not be even, meaning we will not have enough staff in the door until sometime late in 2017. So our deficit of staff on board is creating crises in our facility with the amount of overtime we're asking our staff to work. Even as we train more recruits, we are providing more training to our current staff to give them the best tools to do the job. Over the next few years, staff will receive in-service training that includes use of force, crisis intervention, conflict resolution, direct supervision, safe crisis management for those working with adolescents and young adults, and other training for the aid staff in performing their jobs. You know, we had one type of training. We trained staff on an adult correction model for forever. We didn't really engage in the knowledge that there was a whole bank of evidence out there and research that managing young people there's different ways to do that. There's also brain development, all the kinds of things that were going on in the rest of the world that we had not brought here to New York City. So adding those things to our training, getting our staff skills up to manage these different types of population is really critical in moving this organization forward. We have spoken about the safety measures for officers, and I want to talk a little bit about inmate safety, because enacting reforms, we take a two-pronged approach. Officer safety is critical, and you can't have inmate safety without officers feeling safe. We are working on making our jails safer and creating inmate education opportunities and services that help reduce inmate idleness. When inmates are kept busy in programs that they enjoy and benefit them, in the long term, they are less likely to act out and less likely to cause violent acts. Inmate programs that provide skills and education opportunities help lower inmate recidivism by providing them with the skills they need to transition back to our communities. Most of our inmates are getting back out. They're on the streets. They're your neighbors. They're the people that you see every day. Giving them the skills, giving them choices once they get back out there is a major focus of this. We were at about 0 in program offering other than the basic program required. Now we're at, in some cases, 5 hours of additional program a day in many of our facilities and expanding that every day. So these programs really will teach inmates skills so they can get out and stay out of these jails. We are also reducing violence among inmates by improving the way we house inmates. So traditionally, gangs in New York City have been a problem. Gangs in our jail are just a same thing that's happened in the community comes into the jail, and the violence drivers in our jail are the same violence drivers in our communities. So how do we manage that population in a way that's safe for our staff and safe for the inmates who live there? We created a hub model. The hub model is really how do we classify, which is the typical score, who are the most violent to the least violent, but also what's a safe mix? So what kind of gang mix can we put in a housing unit that we can get good results? We put all of one gang, and the unit runs by, basically that gang's running the unit. So what kind of mixes could we do to get those inmates who could live together, program together, and be safe for them and safe for our officers? So we spent a year designing this model that really has been very effective for us in what we call restarts, which is housing areas that we've cleaned up and retrained officers and then classified the inmates and put them back in place. We've added many programs. One you've probably read about is the Rikers Rovers program, is training inmates to care for dogs that would have been put to sleep as a result of shelters. We bring those dogs, train them up to make them more adoptable. This program has started with adolescents. We've expanded it to adults, and is very effective in teaching responsibility. Also teaching skills and training that people can use when they get out in order to work in those areas. I'd also mention earlier this week, a longtime staff member, Deputy Warden in Command Jacqueline Brantley, who was honored by the Board of Corrections about her work with young adults. The challenges that we see in working in this culture are changing from a culture where our only tool was punishment, so we manage inmates. If you didn't do well, we punish you, to really one that has incentives and punishment. That's a long, long climb for us to get from one model to the next. It's been very challenging in GMDC, where we have the majority of our young adults. So the leadership that Deputy Warden Brantley brings to this organization after 20-plus years of service really shows a commitment to change the culture in New York City. Another special population that in corrections that we never asked for, so it's been kind of a turning point since the 70s, is the mentally ill. In every place I've worked across the country, it's been a challenge. I never came into corrections figuring I was going to run a mental health hospital, but in New York City, on the East Coast, we run the largest mental health hospital on the East Coast. And if we look on the other side of the country, the LA County Jail runs the largest mental health hospital on the West Coast. So as discouraging as that is, we've actually gotten pretty good at managing mentally ill offenders in our jails. Over the last couple of years, we've created programs, we call it CAPS, Clinical Alternatives to Punitive Seg, which allows inmates, rather than serve segregation time, to actually get into a clinical environment where they're managed successfully in a humane way, and we don't use segregation or lockdowns to manage them. We've also, because of that model's success, we've also fashioned a PACE unit, which means you don't have to commit an infraction to get good clinical mental health care. And those, we have 4 in place now. We're opening a 5th one for our young adult population. But these are really moving the mental health care for incarcerated inmates well beyond anything I've ever seen in my 40-plus years. I would look on a national level what states are doing to manage mentally ill offenders in institutions. And most of those states are looking at how do I manage those inmates in a segregation environment because they're violent, they're acting out, they're problematic. We don't do that in New York City. We don't put seriously mentally ill inmates in segregation any longer. We manage them in these clinical units and manage them safely and effectively. Most places you deal with, in this mentally ill population with suicide attempts. We call it smearing when as distasteful as it is, inmates smear feces on themselves as a way of acting out, attempts at self-harm. It does not happen here. It just does not happen here in New York City since we stopped locking those offenders up in segregation. So it's really setting a tone for the country to say you don't need to lock up mentally ill people in order to manage them successfully. Also part of our reforms is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which came about a few years ago. I think it was 15, 20 years in the making before the law actually became effective. Again, a proactive attempt by the City of New York that we applied for a grant before I started, excuse me, to really begin the process of PREA implementation. It is a long process. There are standards that have to be put out. There is training. Policies have to be changed. So we were granted, that grant came on board while I was here. We started that process in 2014 and continue to move that forward. So there's a lot of training that has to be done. There's a lot of policy development and practice that has to change. But this is well underway here in the City of New York. We have currently about 1,200 staff that have been trained in PREA compliance, which is included in all of our basic training, and we'll obviously train all of our staff in that, which will take time. It's ongoing as we speak. I want to talk a little bit about punitive segregation. That's been a topic in kind of across the country on what we're doing with those inmates that we lock in more than 22-hour-a-day incarceration. There's been an 80% reduction in the last 2 years in the use of punitive segregation in New York City. We ended punitive segregation for adolescents in December of 2014 and for 18-year-olds in June of 2016. We have effectively ended punitive segregation as defined by a 22-hour-plus lock-in for 19 and 20-year-olds already in the City of New York. There is no other adult correctional system in the country that's even talking about doing that. It's not even a matter of discussion. The department is rolling out all of its reforms together facility by facility, creating what we call model facilities. So all the things in the 14-point plan that we talked about, from training, infrastructure, to the new classification model, we went cell block by cell block, staff by staff, cleaned the cell blocks up, made sure they function properly, retrained our staff, classified the inmates, and put them all back together, and added the programming piece, and got very good results as a result of using that model. I mean, the results are better than what I could ever even hope for. We've had housing units that have not had incidents in over 200 days. I mean, that's almost unheard of in most of our facilities across the board. Many of our facilities are old, need to be replaced. I think you may have heard the discussion about closing Rikers Island. I mean, it's kind of a topic we've been engaged in for a period of time. But for us practitioners, so to speak, we don't, on Rikers, off Rikers, we need new facilities. And the reason it's important for the citizens of New York to understand we need new facilities, our staffing ratio is nearly 1-to-1. One staff person for every inmate. And so while that is excessive by almost all standards, we got three facilities that are over 25 years old. No one would build correctional facilities in any of our sites today because they're too expensive to operate and they don't have the proper programming space as we need to move forward. So we'll hear a lot more about the on and off Rikers model, but as we speak, we do need new facilities. I know that's a competition between us and other competing city interests, and always corrections is in the usually the back of the line. So the slide we have up here is just again, these. I want to be clear that this data is specific to the model facility. So it's only those cell blocks in these facilities that we did the overhaul in. So you see what we achieved in a 72% reduction in use of force, 82% in assaults on staff, and 91% in stabbings and slashings, and those are small numbers. So, you know, when you go from those small numbers to zero, there's a dramatic effect. So we're just proving that this model will work even with the other things that we've done, which is a changing of punitive seg and the other restrictions as we've put in place. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of our reforms in the other parts of our organization. In part because these reforms also impacted the most serious assaults on staff, which have dropped 40% overall in the organization. Now, no assault on staff is ever good. The reduction or the decline is where we want to be headed. You know, we were on an incline up until this year, so having us at least heading in the right direction is very important. Overall assaults on staff have dropped 17%, and again, one assault is one too many. How do we keep this going? Most recently, the mayor and I announced new officer safety measures that included technology upgrades, tasers, I'm sure we may have questions today on tasers, and new scanners to reduce the introduction of contraband. The new scanners are the same type we use in airports, so they don't emit radiation, and so they're very safe. We also had body scanners that are in place on island that we've had for some time and not been able to use because of a state law that limits the use of that equipment. They are used in the federal system here in New York City and used across the country, the body scanners. So we're working on legislation to assist in changing the law to allow an exception to that rule in order for us to use these body scanners on inmates to reduce the weapons in our facilities. We've also taken our emergency service unit, which is a centrally dedicated unit, to put them on site in our buildings to make sure that our emergency response and the support of staff happen in a much quicker fashion. As mentioned earlier, we have approximately 1,200 recruits in our next class, and we'll have 1,200 in the class after that. So at the end of next calendar year, we'll be in a position that will be almost even, meaning that we'll have sufficient staff to man the posts to keep these programs going that we have to in order to keep the organization in a forward-moving trend and also to keep the reforms going here in New York City. So at this time, I think we'll just open it up for questions and ask anything you have. So.
Okay, we have microphones over on two sides, and we ask if you would like to make a short comment or a question that you step up. And I ask Claire from James Capolino's to offer the first comment or question, and please do line up. Let me just say one thing. There's only a couple of people up right now, but I anticipate others. I hope that the comments are short and questions are short so that we give an opportunity to many people who would like to raise issues.
Good morning, Commissioner Pont. Having spent the first 20 years of my career at the Vera Institute of Justice and many hours at Rikers Island, I appreciate the summary of your major reforms that you've undertaken in the short 2-year period you've been there. We all know that you've been particularly focused on a number of reforms to reduce violence, protect juveniles, and reduce the number of individuals awaiting trial due to their inability to make what are often small amounts of bail. We've watched with interest the introduction of the mayor's and yours bail lab program, and would just be curious to see how you assess the results of that, even though it's only been in effect a short time.
So I think it's a great idea. Reduction in population, which is what we hope to achieve, has not happened. It's fairly new. One of the things we're working with the Mayor's Office on Criminal Justice is producing inmates on time to court, which is causing delays in sentencing. So we're almost at 100% on those on trial, which is great. We want to be 100% on all inmates produced to court on time. We think that will help reduce that population in the process.
Thank you.
On this side? Yes. Could you please state your name?
My name, William Stanford, Jr., Mr. Rice. J. Paul, I'm having trouble understanding your proposal about those tasers. I'd like some more information about that. Okay, and as I told you a while back, the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, and I believe that's what this plan is, a one-size-fits-all approach. And as far as Rikers Island-wise, it's not Rikers Island, it's Killer Island. Let's get it right. It's Killer Island, not Rikers Island. Okay? You don't have to do it now, but you need to explain your plan to me a little better, because I'm a little confused. Like, tasers, I'm confused. I got a feeling that you're going to use these tasers for the wrong reason. That's what I am feeling.
Good, that's a good question.
So tasers is a piece of equipment that issued to staff, have been used in police and corrections across the country. It's not appropriate in every situation, but is appropriate in some situations. I believe it will reduce injury to staff and inmates when used appropriately. Where we've had problems with any equipment, be it chemical agent, batons, anything, it's the misuse of the equipment that's caused those problems. This equipment will be limited to those captains who are our first-line supervisors who are trained specifically to manage and respond to emergencies.
Let's see what happens from this point on.
On this side now?
Good morning. I'm Mary Zulak. I teach at one of the other law schools, and we are very interested in the legal education that goes on within Rikers by the librarians and other staff, and I wonder if you could describe that for us.
So we have law library access in all of our facilities. The problems that have happened over time is that the law libraries become like the only event in town, so a lot of inmates go to the law library not because they want to use it for its intended purposes, because there wasn't a lot of other things going on in our jails. While we do have good law library access everywhere, our attempt will be to put kiosks in the cell blocks so the inmate has access to information right there and doesn't even have to move to a specific area to get that. So we're hoping to improve the access to legal information, but also allow that access many more hours of a day than currently is allowed.
On this side now?
Good morning, Commissioner Pont. My name is Janos Martin. I'm with Just Leadership USA, which is one of the nearly 100 organizations across the city which has taken the view that Rikers should be closed based on its 80-year history of violence and corruption that is at times punctuated by short efforts at reform such as you've undertaken. But in our view, the history of it suggests that they won't last and there are better solutions. So my question is, in talking about the reduction of the population there, you've mentioned the mental health population. There's some comments about bail. But I know that you've said before that a large percentage of folks who are at Rikers pre-trial probably don't need to be there and could be, either at home or in some other program. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I know you as a commissioner must take every person sent to you, and that's unfortunately your charge. But in your view, what are the populations that shouldn't be at Rikers at all?
So we know that we've already said that the 16 and 17-year-old population, we're moving off island. We're actually will be in that process fairly soon. So that population, raise the age. And one of the things that actually surprised me coming to New York was that we had 16 and 17-year-olds committed to the adult system. I was actually surprised that we were doing that here in New York. So raise the age, which was done in Connecticut a few years ago, and the outcomes were predicted as being all bad, were all good. So I think if there's one thing we can do now is raise the age, get these young people out of the adult system and put them in the juvenile system where there are many, many more options on how to manage them and how to get them back to the community. So young people would be one population. We talked about women incarcerated. When we incarcerate female offenders, we typically incarcerate families. Many times the female offender is the sole person managing the family. That incarceration, in a sense, causes us years of harm to a structure that was fragile to begin with. So I think better managing that population would be a second population we can do much better at. So those are just two examples.
Commissioner Ponte, Francis Greenberger, Greenberger Center for Social and Criminal Justice. One of the issues that we've seen with the state law that limits segregation with respect to the mentally ill is that the state system has very narrowly defined the criteria of who is mentally ill so that in fact the law is being applied to a limited population. I wonder what you're doing in terms of the city in how you're designating who is in fact mentally ill subject to your non-segregation
Right.
regulations.
So it's defined by mental health. So seriously mentally ill, diagnosed is that caveat that does not go to punitive seg. We have other alternatives to those inmates who may have some mental illness but are not seriously mentally ill. So we kind of, it's graded on severity. So we have options for those that may have mental illness but not are seriously mentally ill. We call them RHUs. And then, obviously then managing that population in the general populations of our jails would be the last piece.
Thank you. Just the concern is that on a state level, that serious mental illness definition is very narrower than it would be clinically. Thank you.
And it is one of those definitions that nationally we're struggling with because you can go from state to state in our definition. So one of the things that we work nationally on is try to come to some uniform standards that as a country we can agree on. And that's been a struggle for us.
Good morning, Commissioner Pont. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your leadership. My name is Stefano Perez, and I'm a second-year law student here at New York Law School. My question for you is, how is the New York City Department of Corrections educating the community on the successful efforts that you outlined in your presentation?
So in corrections, typically, a no news day is a good news day. True. We don't get out there much and to tell our stories. When the mayor came to visit us a short time ago, he actually criticized us in the sense of you need to tell these stories. They don't make the media as well as the other stories do, where we make mistakes and have events. So we try to, in a very informative way, get those stories out. Now with social media, we do a lot more than we've ever done before. But it's just not, it's difficult to sell, so to speak. It's also a population, right? So we think as a society, we lock these guys up so we can forget about them. And reality is that's probably the last thing you want to do. So how do you then manage them? So we're pretty open in the sense of bringing people in, taking people on walkthroughs, explaining what we do. We have a lot of tours coming through and try to do it that way. But you can never do enough to get that information out, and not only just to the public, to our own staff. And we're a large organization. We're struggling with communication internally so all of our staff know some of the stuff that's going on. So it's been a struggle, but something that we know we need to get better at.
Thank you.
Commissioner Pont, my name is Jim Sheehan. A question on encouraging officers to comply with the constitutional requirements and progressive discipline when they don't. One of the issues historically in the corrections area is they're effective and strong unions, but the arbitration provisions and other kinds of grievance procedures make it difficult sometimes for the leadership of the organization to encourage compliance. Have you encountered this issue in the New York system? What have you done about it?
I don't see it as much of a problem in the city. I really don't. I mean, the unions are obviously very strong, and officers are entitled to representation. But, we have a system here that's pretty good. The problems that I faced was that I'm looking at discipline cases that are 3 and 4 years old. So where a staff has done something wrong, we then discipline them 3 or 4 years later. That's just crazy. So one of the things we have to do is clean up that backlog. So if you did something wrong, you know it, you get the punishment, and you can move on. But that process has really delayed staff advancement. So you made a mistake, you corrected it, now you can move on. We've held people up for, it's only a 20-year lifespan, that staff work. So if you hold people up to 3 or 4 years because they got a pending charge, that's significant. So I think we're all on board, the unions and me, in order to speed up the process. And obviously in the Nunes settlement, there's also some talk on the discipline, what the discipline should be. So I think we're in a good place. We're speeding up our investigations. We're getting the backlog down. I'm not looking at cases now that are 2011, 2012 any longer, and that's all going to help us.
Hi, Commissioner DuPont. Thank you for talking to us today. I was wondering if you could talk about measures you're taking to prevent staff retaliation in the case that abuses are reported.
So we typically, if it's a serious event, we what we call modify the officer. So we'll take the officer out of an inmate contact post, so there couldn't be no retaliation. The best response to that is camera coverage. So once we get camera coverage everywhere, we can literally look at anything, anywhere, real time. So if any events occur, we can make sure that we have a record of it and take proper action. So if it's a serious incident, we'll modify the officer to make sure that that particular officer has no contact with that inmate, or in some cases, inmates at all.
Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Alexis Shankman, and I'm a student here at New York Law School. With shows like Law and Order and Orange is the New Black, how is the department working to overcome the poor image that those shows in the entertainment industry portray?
I don't know. We had, I don't remember, Kate Mulgrew, I think, she actually came on island and does some acting work with some of our young people. So she actually understands corrections probably more than most. But it's hard to untell those stories. I mean, we want to believe every story in a newspaper. We want to believe that that's all of our officers. And, you know, the tasers are a good example that, yes, we have had abuse cases. So if we give tasers to staff, then they're just going to use those to abuse inmates. So that image only changes as we improve our credibility, and that happens over a fairly long span of time. Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Rachel Weiner. I'm a second year at Fordham Law School and a co-chair of Fordham Law's Advocates for the Incarcerated. One quick question. So PREA standards specifically only limit cross-gender viewing of inmates during, while they're performing bodily functions or changing their clothing or other points of vulnerability. But there are obvious benefits for eliminating male staff members from a female prison, not the least of which is preventing rape and sexual assault. Considering the recent press that has been brought to light about pending litigation against correction officers in DOC for allegedly sexually harassing women in Rosie's, and then also considering the new admission and training of hundreds of new recruits and increasing the efforts of AIU's investigative methods. Do you think that this increase in staff will allow you to make the Rose M. Singer Center a jail staffed only by female officers?
That's a bargaining unit question. I think it makes sense. We've done that in other jurisdictions where we've had only females in those areas. So that's one facility that the majority of staff are female, but moving that forward is going to take some negotiation, I would assume.
Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Kelly Padden. I'm also a student here. I have one quick question for you. Given the increase in the number of employees that you've mentioned and the significant reforms, how much does it cost per inmate, or do you have that statistic? And is it sustainable to continue these reforms?
So, I mean, you can get those numbers in a lot of ways. You could take the $1 billion plus budget that we have and divide by 10,000 inmates, but that's not even the total cost because it doesn't take into account the medical providers and all the other pieces. It's very expensive. And very expensive for a couple of reasons. One is the types of populations we're dealing with. A young population where we got a staffing ratio of 1 to 15, which used to be 1 to 33. Those drive costs. But it also is the best way to manage and program this younger population. The best thing we could possibly do, and I know we're first focused on getting the number down to how many inmates are incarcerated, but at the end of the day, new facilities will get the cost of corrections in New York City substantially lower than what it is today. It is very, very high.
That was actually my question. I was going to ask if there were intrinsic cost to running Rikers because it's old and because of some of the things you mentioned. So thank you for answering
The staff
that.
ratio of 1 to 1 is, you can't go anywhere in the country and see that. Most of it's like 3, 4 to 1. So that alone would tell you that we are very expensive, probably the most expensive in the country.
And some of the data or some of the reports I've seen don't break out the cost for Rikers, right? It's citywide, and so it includes some of the other borough facilities. Do you, is there any resource that breaks out the cost per detainee as it differs between Rikers and perhaps other borough facilities?
So the Lippman Commission is asking for that information. We've been talking this week to define. So best is define what we're measuring, and then I think we'll have a better conceptual idea pretty shortly as to what that is. You know, with caveats, like what's the medical cost. We have medical care happens in the hospitals. I mean, how do you factor in all those costs to get to a real cost? And again, it's very expensive.
Thank you,
We can agree on
Commissioner.
Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Ariel Peterson. I'm with the Department of Buildings, but I'm also a human services major. You were very vocal in how the housing arrangements would be changed, and you also voiced that the inmates should be taught different skills, but I wasn't really clear on what skill sets you intended to implement in those areas. Are they going to receive schooling, workshops, resume building, any counseling?
So all of those are factors. You know, in jails, our populations are turn over fairly quickly. So looking at short-term kinds of things. We offer full education for 16 and 17-year-olds. It's required by law. We offer education for 18 to 21-year-olds, not required by law, but we're looking to try to change that law. Education, as we know nationally, is the number one thing that will help offenders stay out of jail and prison. But we also offer certificate programs, from food handling to you know, traffic controls on construction sites. A lot of really short-term things to dog handling, how to train. So it's a myriad of pieces. You know, for the first time in the history of the New York City Department of Corrections, we offer reentry services to 16 and 17-year-olds. That's just happened. So some of the things that you would think, well, it's kind of important, about half of that population gets out and back to the community. Unless you're in a specific category, you didn't get reentry services. In other words, how do you take the offender from the incarceration phase to the community?
Right.
What I know in Maine, because we ran the juvenile system in Maine as part of the adult system, with young people, they fail at a higher rate and they fail much sooner, meaning they go back to the environment they were out in. That peer pressure brings them back into the criminal element. So that's a real important piece on the reentry for young people to make sure that they're probably back in the community and functioning in a way that's appropriate.
A suggestion? As a student and as someone in that age range, I believe that along with education comes, in their circumstance, you need someone to talk to in that aspect as well, because you can learn anything. If you don't feel like you can do it once you're back in that environment, they'll be right back. So I get the ricochet of the situation where you say.
I mean, you're absolutely right. So what's the common thread for for a young person who's been involved and has had a difficult life, involved in criminal? What's the common theme that got them out of that?
Doubt.
Yeah, it's that one person who believed them. It's giving them the confidence to begin to believe in themselves. So that relationships in managing young people is we teach our staff to develop those positive relationships with these young inmates in order to be role models for them. and they can be. So that's an important piece that's not in a program per se, but what we do every day.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Commissioner. How do you see the opening in a few weeks of a bureau of the Bronx DA's office on Rikers Island?
I think it's probably one of the biggest things. It actually happened years back and was very helpful. I think it's probably one of the biggest things that is happening for us and will help the prosecution of criminal cases. It's also added ADAs to DA Clark's group, so be able to process in a timely way these criminal actions is going to be extremely helpful. And have a group that's dedicated to Rikers Island is going to be a really good thing. So we're very hopeful.
Hi, Commissioner. My name is Nellis. I'm with Just Leadership. My question to you is that since you said that you want to increase staff per inmate, if your idea is to decrease population numbers, then wouldn't it make more sense to take a different approach, such as community building, programming? You spoke of programming, personal development programs within communities.
So we don't incarcerate anybody, so we don't get to decide who comes to jail and who
Right.
leaves. And some of the Lippman's Commission's looks is to look at, facilities and boroughs. Does anybody know how long it takes, what were some buildings, how long it takes to build a facility in the city of New York? I mean, it's about 10 years. So if we had a site today and had the money, it would take, so we need to do in the meantime. So it's kind of like bridging, what are we doing in the meantime while we get programs up? While, as we know, the mayor's wife's working hard on mental health issues in the city of New York. So all those pieces are great once they take hold. In the meantime, we need to run these jails safely. And we're not trying to increase staffing as much as replace staff that are leaving because of the 20-year retirement bill. So it's the rotation of staff that's more important. We don't have enough staff to do what we want to do today, and so we need to make sure that that staff is on board and healthy.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I want to thank the questioners. I thought the questions were really good and short and gave the commissioner a chance to actually give us very substantive answers, and we really do appreciate that. I also think it's interesting that so many of you know so much about Rikers Island. So you have a lot of fans out there, and I understand that there are arrangements for people who can tour in certain ways, and I hope that that more opportunities are taken for people to actually see what you're doing and to hear, not just hear, but to see what goes on and how those reforms are taking place. I also want to thank you for a strong reform message, and I really appreciate hearing that, and we have even more respect for what you're doing and what you're attempting to accomplish. So thank you for sharing that with us today. We always like to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of this law school, and generally I don't use something that I was involved with, but this is a book called Democracy by Decree, and it's a book that my colleague David Schoenbrod and I wrote about how commissioners can live under consent decrees. So I give it to you with good luck, because our next speaker will be former Commissioner Bill Bratton on October 7th. We welcome everybody to come on that occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.